Hello, could you help me grow this channel? Subscribing is totally free. Just one click below this video is all it takes.
I always believed that if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, and smiled at the right times, I'd eventually earn my mother's respect. Maybe not her love, because love from her came with terms and conditions, but at least a sliver of recognition. The kind of acknowledgement that she so effortlessly poured over my sister Samantha, like syrup on pancakes. Thick, sweet, and always in excess. So when Ethan proposed to me after 4 years of unwavering patience, my first thought wasn't about the dress or the venue or the music. It was, foolishly, naively, about what Mom would say. I thought, maybe this will be the moment she looks at me like she does Samantha. The irony, she did look at me, but only to humiliate me. The engagement dinner was at a fancy French restaurant downtown. The kind where the waiters pronounce salmon like it's a privilege to be allowed to serve it to you. The lighting was low, the wine was bottomless, and the smiles, oh, they were plastered on like cheap wallpaper in a rundown motel. Samantha arrived 20 minutes late in a backless dress and a cloud of expensive perfume, tossed her clutch on the table like she owned the place, and hugged Ethan longer than she did me. I pretended not to notice. Ethan didn't. It was after the entrees, some dish I couldn't pronounce, smothered in butter and prestige, that my mother stood up, glass in hand, her red nails wrapped tightly around the crystal stem like she was about to strangle a secret out of it. She smiled that tight-lipped smile she reserved for country club photo ops and neighborhood gossip sessions, then cleared her throat, just loud enough to make everyone stop talking. "I just want to say how proud I am of my daughters," she began, already using that tone. That condescending, performative, painfully rehearsed tone she used at church banquets and charity luncheons. Raising 2 girls wasn't always easy. One of them always knew exactly where she was going, exactly what she wanted, and she got it. Beautiful, successful, the whole package. Samantha, sweetie, you really are the best of us. Everyone chuckled. My aunt gave a soft clap. Samantha did that faux shy wave, like this kind of praise just happened to her, like a light summer rain. I took a sip of wine that suddenly tasted like vinegar. "And Rachel," Mom continued, not missing a beat. "Well, she's always marched to the beat of her own drum. Took the scenic route, right, honey?" Laughter again. Polite, scattered, meaningless. Then she raised her glass, and this part, I remember it like it's etched into my skull. "To the one daughter who's actually accomplished something." Silence for a heartbeat. Then laughter, loud, ugly, rolling laughter that echoed off the walls like a slap. Ethan didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just stared at her, that slow burn behind his eyes rising like a storm cloud. I didn't say anything. I nodded, raised my glass, smiled like I was part of the joke, like I wasn't being gutted in front of people I barely liked, but still wanted to impress. Later, I'd stand in front of the mirror and try to mimic that smile, wide, controlled, perfectly curated, and realize it looked exactly like hers. That night, when we got back to Ethan's apartment, ours now, technically, he didn't even take off his shoes. He just sat on the edge of the couch, hands folded like he was trying not to say something reckless. I tried to change the subject. I joked about the wine, about the dessert being too rich, about the valet who almost took the wrong keys, but he didn't bite. Finally, he looked at me and said, "Do you actually like them, or are you just used to it?" I didn't have an answer, not one that wouldn't sound pathetic, so I said nothing. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and continued, "Because if that's what your mom says at your engagement dinner, I don't even want to imagine what she's going to pull on our wedding day." Still, I stayed silent. My ears buzzed. My throat tightened. I hated that he saw it. How much it hurt me. How much I still craved something that woman was never going to give me. Then softly, almost like he was offering an escape, he asked, "What if we moved the wedding?" I stared at him. At first I thought he meant postponing it. But he didn't mean that. He meant what if we moved it away, from them, from her, from all of it. That question sat between us for a long while. Heavy, dangerous, tempting, and maybe for the first time in my life, I started to wonder what it would feel like to be free, Not tolerated, not second best, not the butt of a joke, but really, truly free. And that was the night something in me shifted. Not a breakdown, not a scream, just a quiet click, like a lock finally turning. What came next? Well, let's just say, my mother always wanted a story she could tell the ladies at brunch. She got one, just not the version she would have written. Growing up in a household where affection was doled out like a tax refund, conditional, inconsistent, and inevitably disappointing, meant that from an early age, I learned how to read the air more carefully than I ever read my school books. I knew when to stay quiet, when to look busy, and most importantly, when to let Samantha shine without daring to stand too close, because even my shadow might be interpreted as an attempt to steal her spotlight. My mother, Jeanette, always made sure that the line dividing the daughters was crystal clear, and if anyone started to forget who was the star and who was the understudy, she had an arsenal of passive-aggressive compliments and performative gestures to reestablish the order. There was a time, maybe when I was around 9 or 10, when I thought maybe I could bridge the gap between Samantha and me, maybe find a way to share in that strange, golden warmth our mother reserved only for her. I remember we were at some family barbecue, and I just won a school spelling bee. It wasn't state level or anything, just a local thing, but I came home with a certificate and a sense of pride so rare it almost scared me. I showed it to Mom, expecting at least a nod or one of her dry smiles, but all she said was, "That's cute, honey. Samantha just made varsity cheer." And that was it. No fridge display, no phone call to Grandma, just a comparison, a shrug, and the unmistakable reminder. Samantha achieved, I participated. As I got older, I stopped trying to win her approval and started trying to outgrow the need for it. I buried myself in work, in moving out, in building a life where no one called me the difficult one, or reminded me at every family dinner that Samantha bought a house first, got married first, got promoted first. I worked my way up in marketing with no shortcuts, no applause, and definitely no celebratory brunches with my mother in tow. But still, no matter how far I ran, some part of me stayed tethered to that need, that irritating, gnawing hope that maybe one day I'd walk into a room and see that look on her face, the one she gave Samantha when she thought no one was watching, the look of pride, of ownership, of love that wasn't laced with critique. After the engagement dinner, I waited a full day before calling her, not because I was too angry, though I was, but because I needed to find the version of myself that wouldn't tremble when she inevitably turned it into a misunderstanding. I'd practiced what I was going to say in the mirror like a teenager about to break up with their first boyfriend. Calm, concise, deliberate. But the second she picked up and said, "Hey, sweetheart, did you recover from the big night?" In that sing-song voice, I knew none of my rehearsed lines were going to survive. I told her without smiling that her toast was out of line, that it hurt me, that I didn't think it was funny. She laughed, not a mean, spiteful laugh, but that dismissive chuckle she always used when she wanted to erase something without addressing it. "Oh, come on, Rachel, don't be so sensitive. You know how we joke in this family. Besides, you're doing great. I mean, look at you, finally settling down." That word, finally, like my engagement, was a last-ditch effort to keep up, not a genuine connection with a man who actually saw me. I tried to keep my tone even, but I could hear the steel in my voice when I said, "You didn't make a joke, Mom." "You made a point, loudly, in front of everyone." There was a pause, and I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd offer something real. But instead she said, "Well, I'm sorry if you misunderstood me." That was it. That was the apology. Not for the words, not for the years of cutting me with smiles, but for my reaction to them. It wasn't an apology, it was a diagnosis. According to her, I was the one with the problem. When I hung up, I felt hollow, not because I expected better, I didn't, but because I'd allowed myself, again, to hope for something different. That same night, Ethan came home with takeout and sat next to me on the couch like he knew I didn't want to talk, but also couldn't sit in silence. We didn't speak for a while, just ate and watched some documentary about mountain climbers cheating death for fun. until he finally said, "So, have you thought more about the venue?" I nodded, slowly. We were supposed to get married at the old Glencourt Country Club, the same place Samantha had her rehearsal dinner, the same place my parents have celebrated their last 5 anniversaries. It was tradition, and in my family, tradition was less about honoring the past and more about proving that nothing needed to change. But the idea of standing there, in front of those people, with my mother probably planning another harmless toast, made my stomach turn. "I found a place in Vermont," I said carefully, as though saying it aloud might jinx it. "Small lakeside, not fancy but beautiful, and private, very private." Ethan looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "Let's do it." It wasn't dramatic. No defiance, no rebellion, just quiet agreement, just a decision to stop pretending. I knew what this meant. I knew what it would trigger, but something inside me, something that had been waiting far too long, finally exhaled. For the first time in my life, I wasn't choosing their approval, I was choosing mine. And that would come with a price, but for once, I was ready to pay it. There is a very particular kind of silence that descends when a person finally understands, without denial or justification, that something fundamental about their family will never change. That silence, heavy and strangely hollow, had followed me around for days after the phone call with my mother, clinging to the corners of my apartment like a quiet witness to the unraveling of a relationship I had spent my entire life trying and failing to salvage. In that silence, something unexpected happened. Not rage, not sorrow, but clarity. I stopped bargaining with the version of her I wished existed and began strategizing around the one who actually did. The idea to move the wedding wasn't impulsive, though to some it might seem that way. It was calculated, carefully considered, and yes, deeply satisfying in a way that still feels a little dangerous to admit. Ethan, who had always seen through the facade of my family faster than I ever could, didn't need convincing. When I showed him the photos of the lakeside lodge in Vermont, with its sprawling trees, rustic wooden beams, and quiet charm that practically begged for intimacy and authenticity, he looked at me and said, without hesitation, "This feels like us." And that's all it took. Changing the venue, the date, and even the guest list became more than logistics. It became a reclamation. I was no longer orchestrating a performance for people who never truly knew me. I was designing an experience for those who had earned the right to witness this moment. The new guest list was shorter, painfully so in some places, but it was real. My best friend from college, my mentor from work, Ethan's uncle, who once helped us move in the middle of a snowstorm. People who had seen us in our ugliest, rawest moments and loved us anyway. The ones who never compared, never mocked, never asked me why I wasn't more like Samantha. For everyone else, my mother, my father, Samantha, and the curated network of family friends who existed purely for appearances, they received the original invitation, unchanged. Old Glencourt Country Club. Saturday, 4 o'clock. Dress code, formal. I debated for a while whether to send them a follow-up, a polite but firm message explaining the change, giving them a chance to show their true selves by reacting with grace. But the truth is, I already knew how that would go. There would be gaslighting, guilt-tripping, and a barrage of group text threads I'd be expected to respond to with forced politeness. So I didn't. I let the silence speak for itself. Ethan was the one who suggested we at least leave something behind, a note or a message for when they showed up at the empty venue. I considered writing a long letter, explaining everything, walking them through every slight, every hurt, every cruel little remark that had added up over the years into something that felt almost like grief. But in the end, I chose simplicity over explanation. A small handwritten card left with the front desk, addressed simply to Jeanette and Koyu. It read, "You always preferred Samantha. Maybe she'll give you the wedding you wanted." And that was it. As the new date approached, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, guilt, excitement, and a kind of quiet dread. I knew what we were doing was bold, maybe even cruel by some standards, But the deeper I sat with it, the more I realized it wasn't revenge. It was protection. I wasn't burning bridges. I was just refusing to keep rebuilding them alone, without tools, on terrain that was never meant to support anything stable. The morning of the wedding was clear and cool, the kind of Vermont fall day that makes you wonder why anyone ever lives anywhere else. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, and as I stood in front of the mirror in my simple ivory gown, hair loosely pinned and makeup soft, I felt more like myself than I had in years. There was no audience to impress, no matriarch to appease, no spotlight to share. There was just me, Ethan, and a handful of people who loved us not for our potential or proximity to perfection, but for our presence. Ethan's face when he saw me walking toward him under the canopy of oak trees was everything I needed to wash away decades of second-guessing. He didn't just look at me, he saw me, and for once, I didn't feel like I was borrowing someone else's moment. This one was entirely mine. Later that evening, as we sat by the fire with glasses of champagne and the sound of laughter from our guests floating through the cool night air, one of Ethan's cousins asked casually, "So, what do you think's happening right now at Glencourt?" I smiled, slowly, not with smugness, but with the calm satisfaction of someone who had finally taken back a piece of themselves that had been quietly stolen over years of polite compliance. "I think," I said, swirling the champagne gently in my glass, "they're finally learning what it feels like to be excluded." Ethan raised his glass in silent agreement, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to justify my happiness. I didn't have to shrink it to make room for someone else's comfort. And maybe that's what weddings should be about. Not just the beginning of something new, but the end of everything you were never meant to carry into that next chapter. There's a particular stillness that surrounds a secluded lake just before dusk, when the light begins to soften into gold and the shadows stretch long and slow across the water. And in that silence, surrounded by tall pines and the gentle rustle of leaves carried on a cool Vermont breeze, I finally allowed myself to feel the kind of peace that had always seemed like something reserved for other people. People who hadn't spent their lives calibrating every decision against the unpredictable emotional barometer of a mother whose affections were conditional, and who had the uncanny ability to turn even the most joyful occasion into a masterclass in subtle cruelty. As I stood on the edge of the lake in my wedding gown, bare shoulders kissed by sunlight, and the faint echo of string music drifting from the lodge behind me, it hit me, not like a thunderclap, but like the slow, inevitable tide, that this was what it meant to be free. That morning, as I got ready in the quiet bridal suite with two of my closest friends, women who had held my hand through breakups, through breakdowns, through endless family dinners where I was expected to laugh at my own expense, there was no chaos, no judgment, no frantic phone calls from my mother demanding to know where the cake had been sourced or why Samantha hadn't been chosen as maid of honor. There was just warmth, calm, and the kind of laughter that comes from shared history, rather than forced performance. I looked into the mirror and saw a version of myself I barely recognized. Not because she was made up or dressed differently, but because she looked calm, unbothered, even happy. It was a rare kind of happiness, the kind not performed for cameras or squeezed out between anxious glances at my mother's expression. Meanwhile, over 200 miles away, in a meticulously booked and decorated ballroom at Glencourt Country Club, a different kind of scene was beginning to unfold, one I can only imagine in fragments, though piecing it together later through phone calls, texts, and secondhand outrage felt almost like assembling a puzzle I had designed myself. My mother arrived early, of course, dressed in a deep emerald gown that she had purchased 3 months in advance after scouring at least 5 different boutiques. Her hair in its usual stiff, unyielding updo that she claimed made her look regal. Samantha arrived a few minutes later, wearing a dress that could have passed for a bridal gown in its own right, and with her came the entourage. Family, friends, cousins, the neighbors who'd known me since I was in braces, all expecting the typical Parker family event. Elegant, performative, and mildly exhausting. When the staff at Glencourt informed them, politely, awkwardly, that the venue had been reserved, the decorations installed, and even the hors d'oeuvres prepared, but that no bride or groom had arrived. There was a moment of confusion that quickly gave way to irritation, and from there, it descended into something that could only be described as theatrical indignation. My mother, apparently, demanded to speak to the manager, assuming it was some sort of scheduling error. Samantha, with all the subtlety of a soap opera villain, began calling my phone repeatedly, her messages escalating from confused to furious to downright venomous. I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because while they were wandering the halls of that country club looking for their moment in the spotlight, I was walking down an aisle lined with golden autumn leaves and quiet smiles, each step away from that world, a step toward something real. The ceremony itself was short, intimate, and without pretense. Ethan's uncle officiated, having gotten ordained online in what he jokingly called a 10-minute miracle, but his words were heartfelt and grounded in a kind of wisdom that comes not from performance, but from pain. He had lost his wife 2 years prior and spoke about love with a reverence that silenced everyone, even the birds. When Ethan took my hands in his and looked at me, not just at my face, but into me, I felt something that no amount of my mother's approval could have matched. He knew me, all of me, and still chose to stand beside me. Later, as we gathered on the lodge's back patio for dinner beneath hanging lanterns and soft candlelight, someone passed me a phone showing the latest message from Samantha, who had apparently discovered the note I had left at the country club's reception desk. In black ink, on thick white stationery, I had written, "You always liked Samantha better. Maybe she'll give you the wedding you always wanted." That single sentence had cracked open a dam of resentment I hadn't even known I was still holding. There was no room for explanations, no plea for understanding, just a truth that, once said, could never be unsaid. Samantha's message read, "You made a complete fool of this family. You humiliated Mom. You humiliated all of us. For what? A little revenge?" I handed the phone back without responding, not because I didn't have an answer, but because the question itself revealed more than it intended. She still didn't understand that this wasn't about revenge. It was about survival, about finally refusing to participate in a charade that required me to shrink, to smile when it hurt, and to treat cruelty as tradition. As the evening wore on, and the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky, I looked around at the people who had come, those who had chosen me not because I was the accomplished one or the golden child, but simply because I was me. And I felt something I had spent a lifetime chasing, enough. I didn't need 100 guests, or a fancy ballroom, or a toast from a mother who would rather cut me down than lift me up. I needed this moment, this peace. And as Ethan and I shared our first dance under the soft glow of hanging lights, I whispered to him, "Do you think they've left yet?" He grinned and replied, "They probably stayed for the cake." We laughed. Not the bitter kind, but the real kind. The kind that comes from knowing that for once, we had rewritten the ending. And as I rested my head on his shoulder, swaying gently to the music, I felt a quiet conviction settle deep in my chest. Let them eat cake. In the days that followed what I now refer to, half joking and half in awe, as the wedding that wasn't, a strange and quiet stillness filled the space that had once been choked with the noise of, obligations I had never asked for, expectations I had never agreed to, and roles I had spent decades performing just to maintain the fragile illusion of family unity. It wasn't the kind of stillness that felt lonely or sterile, but the kind that suggested a long overdue exhale, a moment when the world paused just long enough for me to hear my own thoughts, without my mother's voice layered over them, correcting, commenting, or condescending. That silence didn't come from a lack of reaction. Far from it. My phone had become a battlefield of unread texts, missed calls, and voicemails that started with thinly veiled confusion and quickly escalated into the kind of emotional warfare that only families seem to perfect, where guilt is the ammunition and love is the shield they pretend they're offering while actually using it to strike. The first call I finally listened to came from my father. a man who had spent his life standing a few safe paces behind my mother, speaking only when she gave the cue, the kind of father who loved in gestures rather than words, and who, for all his silence, I'd always believed harbored some unspoken sympathy for the way I was treated, though if he did, it never translated into action. His message was short and hesitant, filled with pauses and phrases like, "Not sure what happened," and "Your mother's pretty upset," followed by a long sigh and a final, "Maybe we can talk when things calm down." But things weren't going to calm down, and not because I was holding a grudge, but because the very foundation of what they believed family to be had finally been rejected, not quietly and apologetically, like I'd done in the past, but openly, unmistakably, and with just enough elegance to leave them stunned. My mother's response, when it finally arrived, came not in the form of a phone call or even a direct message, but in the form of a long email that began with the subject line, "Disappointed but not surprised." That alone told me everything I needed to know. She didn't ask why I had done it. She didn't ask if I was hurt. She didn't even feign concern for the fact that she had not been present at what should have been one of the most significant days of my life. Instead, she wrote about how my actions had embarrassed her in front of our community, how she had spent weeks planning her dress, her speech, and her dinner table seating chart, how Samantha had been devastated by what she called my petty betrayal, and how it was, in her words, "No wonder you've always felt like the odd one out." She ended the email not with love, not with warmth, but with a line that, despite its venom, felt almost freeing. "You made your choice. Now live with it." And so I did. But the thing is, living with it didn't feel like punishment. It felt like breathing fresh air after years in a smoke-filled room. I didn't reply to the email, not because I didn't have things to say, but because I finally understood that not every truth deserves an audience, and not every wound needs to be explained to the person who caused it. Some things are better left unanswered, not out of bitterness, but out of peace. Real, earned peace. Samantha, true to form, maintained a furious silence that echoed louder than any shouting match ever could. Mutual friends told me she was telling people I had hijacked my own wedding, as if the day had belonged to anyone but me and Ethan. She spun stories about how I had been planning it for months, how it was some kind of elaborate punishment for years of sibling rivalry, and how she had never seen someone so desperate for attention. I didn't argue. I didn't correct the record. Because for once, I didn't care what version of me she sold to the people who had always chosen to see her through rose-colored glasses and me through a fog of misunderstanding. But not all responses were bitter. A week after the wedding, I received a card in the mail, handwritten in cursive, that I recognized instantly. It was my Aunt Lillian, my mother's younger sister, the one who had always stayed slightly removed from the Parker family theatrics, attending holidays out of obligation but never fully engaging in the performance. Her note was brief but potent. "I wish I had done what you did years ago. It takes more courage to walk away from the table than to keep begging for a seat at it. I hope you never sit back down." That message meant more than I could explain, not because it was validation, but because it reminded me I hadn't imagined it. This dysfunction, this hierarchy, this quiet cruelty that wore pearls and smiled for the Christmas card. In the months that followed, as Ethan and I settled into the strange, calm rhythm of newlywed life, there were moments, often while cooking dinner or folding laundry or reading side by side in bed, when the memory of my mother's voice would drift back into my head, uninvited, trying to rerun scenes I had already closed the curtain on. But instead of letting those memories take root, I would whisper, sometimes out loud, sometimes just to myself, "I'm not going back." It wasn't a threat or a vow, it was a fact. And yet the ambiguity never fully vanished. Because here's the complicated truth that no one tells you about walking away from family. It doesn't come with a clean break. It comes with questions that echo long after the applause dies down. Questions about forgiveness, about legacy, about whether the absence of a mother's love is something you ever stop craving, no matter how old you get or how many people surround you with the real thing. Even now, sometimes I wonder, had she said sorry, really said it, not dressed in sarcasm or twisted into a backhanded compliment, but plainly, truthfully, would it have changed anything? Could I have welcomed her back into my life? Would I have wanted to? But she didn't say it, and that silence was her choice, just like leaving was mine. So when people ask if I regret it, if I feel sad that my wedding day didn't include the people who raised me, I tell them the truth, not the polite version, but the honest one. I say, I got married surrounded by love, and for once my family wasn't invited. And in that one sentence lives everything they need to know. The rest, as they say, is just noise.